Welcome to AfriFacts, a channel where we explore the untold truths about Africa and its place in the world. Today, we tackle a sensitive yet critical topic. 7 barriers Africa must overcome for true freedom and prosperity. Africa is a continent rich in resources, culture, and human potential, yet it continues to struggle with economic dependency, political instability, and underdevelopment. Despite decades of independence from colonial rule, many African nations remain trapped in systems that limit their growth and self-sufficiency. For Africa to achieve true freedom and prosperity, it must break away from historical burdens, exploitative economic structures, and internal weaknesses that keep it from reaching its full potential. This requires bold leadership, a shift in mindset, and strategic policies that prioritize African interests. Here are 7 key obstacles Africa must overcome to secure a future of self-reliance, economic strength, and unity. Number 7 is tricky and seems non-existent, yet, it is more real than the other 6. Watch to the end to find out more. For Africa to be truly free and prosperous, there are several systemic barriers that need to be broken. Here are 7 key things. The first of such barriers is dependency on foreign aid. Over-reliance on aid stifles self-sufficiency and innovation. Africa needs to prioritize self-reliance through industrialization, local entrepreneurship, and better governance. Foreign aid can have both positive and negative effects on African economies. Here are some of the key disadvantages. 1. Dependency syndrome. Many African countries rely heavily on foreign aid, which discourages self-sufficiency and local economic growth. This creates long-term dependence rather than fostering sustainable development. 2. Weakens local industries. Aid, especially in the form of free goods, such as food aid, can undercut local producers, making it difficult for them to compete and grow. This harms local businesses and industries. 3. Corruption and mismanagement. Large sums of aid money often fall into the hands of corrupt politicians and elites, reducing its impact on the people who need it most. Funds meant for development are sometimes diverted for personal or political use. 4. Political influence and neo-colonialism. Donor countries sometimes use aid to exert political and economic influence over African nations. This can lead to policies that benefit foreign interests rather than local needs. 5. Encourages debt accumulation. Many African countries receive aid in the form of loans that must be repaid with interest. This leads to high levels of debt, limiting future economic growth and increasing dependency on international financial institutions. 6. Distorts local priorities. Governments may focus on projects that attract foreign aid rather than those that align with their country's long-term development needs. This can lead to misallocation of resources. 7. Inflation and economic distortions. A large influx of foreign currency can cause inflation, making goods and services more expensive for local populations. It can also distort exchange rates, making exports less competitive. 8. Short-term focus instead of sustainable development. Many aid programs focus on immediate relief rather than long-term economic transformation, making it difficult for African nations to build strong, independent economies. 9. Brain drain. Some aid programs, particularly scholarships and job offers abroad, encourage the migration of skilled professionals, leading to a shortage of talent in key sectors like healthcare, education, and engineering. 10. Weakens government accountability. Governments that rely on foreign aid may feel less accountable to their citizens since they are not dependent on tax revenues. This can reduce incentives for good governance and democratic development. The second barrier Africans must break loose from is colonial-era economic systems. Many African economies are still structured to export raw materials and import finished goods. This keeps wealth outside the continent. Industrialization, value addition, and intra-African trade must be prioritized. Colonial-era economic systems had long-lasting negative effects on Africa, many of which are still visible today. Here are some key negative impacts. 1. Extraction-based economies. Colonial powers structured African economies around resource extraction, minerals, cash crops, etc., for export to Europe rather than local industrialization. This left many African economies dependent on raw materials instead of diversified industries. 2. Infrastructure for exploitation. Roads, railways, and ports were built primarily to extract and export resources, not for internal development. As a result, many African countries still lack well-connected transport networks that support regional trade and economic growth. 3. Cash crop dependence. Colonizers forced African nations to specialize in cash crops, cocoa, cotton, tea, etc., rather than food production, making them vulnerable to global price fluctuations and food insecurity. 4. Destruction of indigenous industries. Traditional industries, such as textile production, metalworking, and local crafts, were suppressed or destroyed to make African markets dependent on European imports. This weakened local economic resilience. 5. Monetary and financial dependence. Many African countries inherited colonial currencies and financial systems tied to European economies, making it difficult to control their own monetary policies. Some former French colonies, for example, still use the CFA franc, which is linked to France's financial system. 6. Unequal land distribution. Colonial governments often took land from local communities and gave it to European settlers. After independence, land ownership remained unequal in many countries, leading to conflicts and economic disparities. 7. Labor exploitation and forced migration. Colonial economies relied on forced labor and migrant labor systems, e.g., South Africa's mining industry, which disrupted African communities and created lasting inequalities in employment and wages. 8. Weak industrial base. Colonial economies discouraged industrialization in Africa to ensure that raw materials were sent to Europe for processing. This left many African nations without strong manufacturing sectors, making them reliant on imports. 9. Economic policies favoring foreign interests. Even after independence, many African countries continued economic policies that favored foreign companies and investors over local businesses, often due to agreements made during colonial rule. These colonial-era economic structures still shape Africa's development challenges today. Would you like an analysis of how African nations are working to overcome these legacies? The third barrier is weak leadership and corruption. Corrupt and visionless leadership has held Africa back for decades. True prosperity requires accountable, people-centered leadership with long-term development goals. The fourth is artificial borders and economic fragmentation. Colonial powers drew arbitrary borders, dividing ethnic groups and merging rival communities. This led to economic fragmentation, trade barriers, and conflicts that continue to hinder economic integration and stability. Africa's colonial borders were designed to divide and weaken the continent. Disunity has led to conflicts, weak trade ties, and limited regional cooperation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is a step in the right direction, but deeper integration is needed. The fifth is neglect of education and innovation. Many African countries underfund education and research. To be prosperous, Africa must invest in quality education, science, and technology, while ensuring that curricula align with modern economic needs. The sixth is resource exploitation by foreign powers. Africa is rich in resources but lacks control over its exploitation. Foreign corporations extract resources while giving little back. African nations must renegotiate contracts, invest in local processing, and ensure wealth benefits their people. Number 7 is technical and seems non-existent, yet, it is more real than the other 6 earlier mentioned. It is mental colonialism and inferiority complex. Mental colonialism refers to the psychological and cultural effects of colonialism on African people that persist long after the physical end of colonial rule. It is the internalization of the values, attitudes, and perceptions that were imposed by colonial powers, which continue to shape the thoughts, behaviors, and self-identity of African individuals and societies. One of the most damaging outcomes of mental colonialism is the development of an inferiority complex among Africans, who may view themselves, their culture, and their heritage as inferior to those of the colonizers. The roots of mental colonialism. 1. Cultural devaluation. During colonialism, African cultures, languages, and traditions were often depicted as primitive, backward, and uncivilized, while European ways of life were portrayed as superior. Colonial education systems were designed to erase indigenous knowledge and values, promoting European languages, religions, and customs as the proper way of life. Africans were taught to aspire to European standards, often distancing themselves from their own identities and heritage. 2. European superiority and racism. Colonialists viewed Africans as inferior, with racial stereotypes framing them as uncivilized, unintelligent, and incapable of self-rule. These beliefs were embedded in colonial policy, law, and social structures, reinforcing a racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. Over time, Africans internalized these negative stereotypes, leading to feelings of inadequacy and a belief that their culture, intellect, and potential were inherently inferior. 3. Language and education. The imposition of European languages, especially English, French, and Portuguese, as the primary means of education and communication further deepened the sense of inferiority. African languages and oral traditions, which were once central to community life, were marginalized, leading to a loss of cultural identity and self-worth. Africans began to view their native languages as inferior and less valuable than the languages of the colonizers. The inferiority complex in Africa. The inferiority complex manifests itself in various ways, both on an individual and societal level. It is the internalized belief that Africans, as a group, are less capable, less intelligent, and less worthy than people from other parts of the world, particularly those from former colonial powers. 1. Self-doubt and lack of confidence. Many Africans, particularly in post-colonial societies, struggle with a lack of self-confidence. They may doubt their abilities and feel they are not capable of achieving success on their own terms. This is often rooted in the deep-seated belief that European culture, systems, and values are inherently superior to African ones. 2. Adopting Western standards. In some African societies, there is a tendency to adopt Western standards of beauty, fashion, education, and success, while disregarding indigenous African norms and values. This is seen in the preference for lighter skin, European hairstyles, and Western lifestyles, all of which are often considered indicators of success and sophistication. This reinforces the idea that being African is somehow less desirable or less refined. 3. Cultural alienation. The pressure to conform to Western ideals can lead to cultural alienation, where individuals distance themselves from their African roots. This can lead to a loss of cultural heritage and a disconnection from the community. Many Africans, especially those in urban areas, may struggle to reconcile their traditional upbringing with the demands of a modern, globalized world that often prizes Western ideals. 4. Socioeconomic disparities. The legacy of mental colonialism contributes to persistent socioeconomic inequalities. Colonial systems prioritized the development of infrastructure, industries, and education systems that benefited the colonizers and their interests, leaving Africans at a disadvantage. The continued focus on Western-oriented economic models often limits African nations' ability to build self-sustaining, equitable economies. This perpetuates the idea that African solutions are inferior or unworkable, leading to reliance on foreign aid and investment. 5. Psychological trauma. Mental colonialism can result in psychological trauma, as it forces Africans to grapple with the dissonance between their inherited colonial values and their cultural identity. Many individuals experience feelings of shame or guilt about their African heritage, which can lead to depression, anxiety, and identity crises. These emotional struggles can be compounded by the societal pressures to conform to external standards of success. Overcoming mental colonialism and the inferiority complex. 1. Reclaiming African identity. The first step in overcoming mental colonialism is reclaiming African identity, culture, and history. By embracing indigenous languages, traditions, and philosophies, Africans can rebuild their sense of self-worth and pride. Education that highlights Africa's rich history, achievements, and contributions to the world can help counter the negative stereotypes fostered during colonial rule. 2. Promoting African unity and Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, a movement that advocates for the unity and solidarity of African people across the continent and diaspora, can be a powerful tool in combating mental colonialism. By emphasizing shared history, common struggles, and collective progress, Pan-Africanism helps to reinforce the idea that Africans, as a people, are capable of achieving greatness independently of foreign influences. 3. Empowering African youth. Empowering the youth with knowledge about their history, culture, and potential is key to breaking the cycle of inferiority. Young Africans need to be taught to value their heritage and to understand that their intellectual, artistic, and scientific contributions are just as valuable as those from any other part of the world. 4. Encouraging African innovation. Encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship within Africa can help challenge the notion that only Western solutions work. By focusing on creating local solutions to local problems, African nations can develop self-sustaining economies that do not rely on external aid or influence. 5. Reviving African languages. Revitalizing and promoting the use of African languages in education, media, and daily life can help restore cultural pride. Language is a powerful tool for cultural identity, and speaking one's native tongue helps reinforce the value of African heritage. Mental colonialism and the inferiority complex are deeply rooted in Africa's history, but they are not insurmountable. By reclaiming our cultural identities, promoting unity, and focusing on self-empowerment, Africans can overcome the psychological scars of colonialism and build a future grounded in pride, self-worth, and independence. This requires collective effort from individuals, governments, and institutions to reshape mindsets and foster an environment where African cultures and achievements are celebrated and valued. By addressing these 7 issues, Africa can move toward real independence, economic strength, and long-term prosperity. Thanks for watching. Here is how you can support our mission at AfriFacts. Like this video to support our mission of uncovering African history. Subscribe to AfriFacts for more deep dives into the rich and diverse stories of Africa. Share this video to spread the word about Africa's heritage far and wide. Let's continue celebrating Africa's remarkable past and reclaim its place on the global stage.